Welcome to yet another Swift deep dive. In this episode, we're going to talk about optionals and what the heck are optionals. So we keep seeing these exclamation marks and question marks all over our code, especially when we find it from Stack Overflow or when we see it in the Swift documentation. Now, what exactly does it mean and how do we use it? So in order to understand this better, I want to introduce you to our shared cat, Fluffy. So this is our cat that we have to look after now, you and me. But we have to transport our cat, and we're going to do that in a cardboard box. So Fluffy goes into the box, and we're pretty sure that currently we have definitely a real cat in the box.
Yeah, no.
But let's say that during the hectic time of moving, we also accidentally popped a bottle of poison into the same box as Fluffy. So now we package it up and we kind of move it around in the van, shake it around, and the poison bottle might be broken. And we now basically have an optional cat, right? We have a cat with a question mark at the end of it. We don't know if Fluffy is dead or alive. And if we were to force open or force unwrap our box and see what's inside, well, we might discover that indeed we do still have Fluffy. She's alive and well, and she's smart enough to not eat the poison because, we're good at rearing cats. But we might also find that Fluffy is no more. She got tempted by the poison. It smelled like Play-Doh, so she had a little bit, and now Fluffy's dead. So we might actually have no cat, which in programming lingo we would call nil. This is essentially how optionals work. There's frequently cases where you need a container, so a variable, that might often need to start out containing no data. Let's say that you had a field in your app where you were going to save the user's username. Well, before they actually create it, that username variable is going to be nil. But then hopefully at a later date, when you need to use the username to display it on screen or to use it in some way, then you're hoping that the user has already filled it in. So it does in fact have a value. In order to represent this uncertainty, in Swift, we use something called optionals. So you've seen that when we create a variable, we can specify a data type at the point of creation. So we could add a colon and then add the type of data that this variable or this container or cardboard box is going to store. But then we can add a question mark at the end of our data type to turn it into a completely different data type. And it becomes a optional data type. So now this variable hardness can store a string, or it can simply be empty. It could have no data or store nil. In a blank playground, I'm going to create a new variable and I'll call it player1 username. And I'm going to set it to be a string data type. And at the very beginning of the game, before any player has even gotten the chance to assign themselves a username, well, this variable is not going to contain any data, right? It's going to contain no data or nil. And as soon as you try to run this, because our variable is only meant to hold data of string data types, it gives us an error. So we can't just simply take a normal variable container and try to give it no data. What can we do instead? Well, we could instead create a variable called player1 username, and instead of assigning it to a string data type, we give it a string with a question mark at the end. So now it's a optional. And now I can quite easily say that actually this player1 username has no data stored in it. But at a later date, I'm going to ask the player, well, what is your username? And they'll give me a username, which might, let's say, Jack Bauer is awesome. So now I have a value inside my optional player1 username. So if I was to print my player1 username at this point, you will see a optional string being printed. So the word optional and then a string. So how can we turn it from an optional, which it is at the moment, which you can see right here, but you can also check by holding down the optional Alt key. You can see that its data type is clearly an optional string. Well, we could simply just force unwrap it. So we unwrap our box and accept whatever the consequences may be, and we try to use the unwrapped version. Now, if I run my code again, you can see that my optional has become a normal string again. And in fact, if I simply go ahead and create a new variable called unwrapped p1 username, and I set it equal to player1 username unwrapped, then you can see that when I check the data type of this unwrapped p1 username, it's now back to a normal string. So it's no longer an optional anymore because I have overridden the safety check. So the safety check is there to prevent us from crashing and burning when we try to do something with a nil value, so a null value. Let's say if at some later point I changed my player1 username to again equal nil. So let's say that the player has reset their username. And in fact, I'm going to comment out this line just to make it a bit clear what's going on here. So we started out by creating a container that can hold nil values, so an optional string data type. And it started out being nil, but then we gave it a value, but then we removed the value, and player1 username no longer contains any data on line 10. So now if we try to print it and we unwrap it forcibly, saying that I am so sure that this will definitely always have data, computer, listen to your master, which is me, the programmer, just do as I say, and we run it, and then all it's going to do is crash, because if we have a nil value that we're trying to do something with, say we're trying to add 2 to nothing, it doesn't make any sense. If we try to print nothing, if we try to do anything with a nothing data, it's like taking thin air and trying to do something with it. So that's when our app would crash. In order to prevent this from happening, we can enact some safety checks. The first safety check is actually your brain. The reason why a lot of things are optionals are that you are reminded that some of these values can have nil as its value. You want to be able to check through the code and make sure that it won't ever become nil. Now, another way of doing this is we can actually just explicitly check to see if player1 username does not equal nil. So that's what that exclamation mark equals means. It means does not equal. And in that case, well, then we could use it and we can unwrap it forcibly. Because now, even though player1 username is equal to nil, our app is no longer going to crash because it's going to bypass the line that would cause an issue. Because this is not true, player1 is in fact equal to nil, then we're going to skip the line and we're not going to crash our app by using a piece of data that's nil. Now, there's a really fun comic that somebody once made on if programming languages were weapons. And one of the biggest problems with a lot of older languages, like Java, is this idea of a null pointer exception. So this is essentially the same as what we've been talking about. So it says that Java is a belt-fed 240G automatic weapon where sometimes the belt has rounds, sometimes it doesn't. So sometimes it has data, sometimes it's equal to nil. And when it doesn't and you try to fire it, then you get a null pointer exception, or you get an error like we did and the gun explodes and you die. So this is one of the biggest problems with some of these older languages. And the way that Swift was designed is to be a safer language. So the gun doesn't explode in your face and you actually have a fun time using it. But in order for it to work, we have to understand when we're using an optional and to make sure that if we are unwrapping it with an exclamation mark, that we're certain that it's never going to be equal to nil. If we're not certain, then we should probably check for it and to prevent our app from crashing. so that lines where we're unwrapping are optional are protected by an if statement. Now, in later lessons, we're going to dive deeper into some other fancy things that you can do with optionals, such as optional chaining and optional binding. But for now, I just wanted to introduce you to the idea of a nil value, that a variable can actually contain no data at all. And the idea that if you tried to do something with nil, then your program will likely crash. And optionals are there to safeguard us from these situations, first by making us think about whether if it could be nil, and second by getting us to protect against those scenarios. So now that you've learned a bit more about optionals, it's time to head over to Replit and complete the assignment that is on beginning optionals. And on the next lesson, we're going to head back into building our app.